Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're looking at Barack Obama's Europe pivot. It's the first time ever that he's been to Brussels since he became the U.S. president. He's had a busy couple of days, as we've been saying, and as we'll look at a bit more closely now as he heads to Rome. With us from Washington, Bruce Stokes of the Pew Research Center, and here in the studio, Andrei GRATCHEV, who writes for Novaya Gazeta, who was Mikhail Gorbachev's spokesperson, former State Department official Laurie DUNDON, Raquel GARRIDO of the Party of the Left, the Parti de Gauche, and also with us Jakob HAESLER, who is the co-president of TinyClues. What does TinyClues do?
TinyClues is a software company that makes big data predictive analytics software. All
right, the love affair between the U.S. and Europe, we're going to put it to the test a little bit later on when we talk about trade. Yeah. So we'll ask you about that when it comes up. Before the break, we were talking about the newfound raison d'etre that we found this Wednesday for NATO, with the U.S. president saying that there are exercises going on. The U.S. Senate expected later in the day to approve sanctions and aid for Ukraine after they dropped provisions that would tie the package to IMF reforms. That's much to the delight of Republican hawks.
And I also speak again in the strongest terms that we need to send military assistance to this country. We need to help them defend themselves. Russian troops are massed on the border of eastern Ukraine as we speak. I don't know whether Vladimir Putin will go into eastern Ukraine. I did predict that he would go into Crimea. Now I believe he is watching carefully for the reaction of the West, led by the United States of America.
Of course, in part one of our discussion, Bruce Stokes, you said that 6% of Americans support military intervention. Does that make John McCain a one-man army?
Well, it certainly means that he's got a very small choir behind him. Only about a quarter of the public would support even strong economic sanctions. Over half the public does not want to get involved in the Ukraine. So one of the challenges facing those who want to get tougher on Russia is that they have yet to convince the American public that that's in the U.S. self-interest.
Andrei GRATCHEV?
Yeah. Senator McCain has just said that he had predicted that Putin would go into Crimea. I think that in this sense, maybe he knew about that before Putin himself, because 3 months ago, Putin didn't have an idea at all of going into Crimea. In a way, Crimea has fallen into his hands as a fruit and as a result of a succession of, I would say, terrible errors that have been made first by the Ukrainian elite, corrupted and delegitimatized since already the time of the first Orange Revolution. And then I would say a completely erroneous handling of the Ukrainian case by the European Union. And here I would support what Jakob has just said. Ukraine being a kind of the composite country representing the diversity of peoples. It's not a people or the people yet, maybe. You are having the diversity of it, and let's not forget about the people of the Crimea. And so to put Ukraine before an impossible choice, either Europe or Russia, that was the direct road to tearing or to breaking up this society. And actually, what makes me very concerned is that this approaches, or let's say, is moving the situation closer to the analogy with Yugoslavia. Too many lines and too many aspects of the Ukrainian situation remind of Yugoslavia. You are having on this territory the meeting of different former empires, different religions, sometimes different languages, but even different memories of the Second World War. Because during the Second World War, you were having different parts of this society fighting each other at the side of different sides during this war. So the whole of it is making out of the Ukrainian society an analogy of the giant political Chernobyl. And that's the reason why it had to be handled with extreme care. While at the moment when Putin, not yet thinking about invading Crimea, has suggested to the European Union a three-party formula to handle the case of European rapprochement with the European Union, it was rejected. Then next time when Europe, in a way, in the eyes of Putin, had betrayed him, was at the time when an agreement was reached in Kiev about a transition period when the whole of the Ukrainian society would have time to prepare for the elections. Well, it didn't stand the half an hour before it was rejected by Maidan. So when we are speaking about the necessity for the Ukrainian people to make a choice, let's make sure that we are not meaning a Maidan people who has still to get the legitimization of the whole Ukrainian society.
But to be more inclusive, I can't let you get away without asking you about what your former boss said, Mikhail Gorbatchev, who says that it was the redress of a Soviet-era mistake, Russia taking over Crimea.
Well, Gorbachev, being half Russian, half Ukrainian, you can imagine that this is a terrible choice for him, but like many Russians and many Crimeans, he was living as a kind of historic injustice, the fact that Crimea has been attached to Ukraine. But at that time, the decision which was made by Khrushchev in '54, Crimea could, why not, become part of Ukraine, because both Ukraine, Crimea, and Russia were all Soviet. So they were part of one state. After that, I would say the conditions for the smooth handling of the situation was at least the minimum condition that Ukraine remains ally and close to Russia. At the moment when Putin had discovered a new face and a new danger of Ukraine going west and maybe becoming NATO member, the conditions of this bargain had been broken.
Raquel Garrido is...
Yeah, I just wanted to add to our discussion that I was clearly very shocked today by Obama's interventions in favor of selling fracking gas, American fracking gas, to Europeans, because he openly, bluntly, and unsubtly used the Ukrainian situation to say, look, you're importing gas from over there, so you're not independent, but we, the Americans, we have fracking, from fracking, we can sell you gas, and then you can come with us. I found that quite shocking, because on the same time, he's saying that he wants to respect environmental principles, but fracking, the opposition to fracking is a core principle in Europe, in France at least,
and this
but
is
in other
one of
countries.
the big points of contention. Jakob HAESLER, on the issue of fracking.
Well, I'm not so shocked by that, because you can argue that if you don't want to do saber rattling, well, and you're in a diplomatic and you sit at a big table, well, maybe changing the returns and the payoffs for the different people, depending on who does what to whom, may be a good thing to do and to think about. The very fact, though, is today that it's completely unrealistic in any time near to think that gas or energy from the US could replace gas from Russia. But that being said, it doesn't shock me as a posture that much. What I found interesting more is that the US are rediscovering Europe, and there is a subtle change in power, which is the US will not go saber rattling to Ukraine or to Eastern Europe. Well, they need to rely on the Europeans. So there is more power. This conflict will not be solved if the Europeans don't solve it. And I think the US, because they have been across the board more retrenching from international conflict, arguing about the times of war is over, they've maneuvered themselves in a way where they now depend more on Europe than they used to. That's why they now need to say we are such good allies, because they need us.
There is something quite pathetic indeed to come into Europe and ask for money for NATO, because typically NATO, 50% of the world military expenses are from the United States, 80% with the allies. in total. And now you have the US president coming to Europe and say, well, you need to put more money on the table for NATO. I think it's quite sad. But and it shows. I think it shows a shift in relations.
If you said that to the American public,
Go ahead, Bruce Stokes.
you would say the American public would say we spend twice as much as a part of our GDP on defense as the Europeans. Why should we care more about Europe's defense than they do?
Well, they shouldn't. I agree with that.
Laurie,
And I think
DUNDON.
one of the questions is, I mean, one
It
of
makes the
the
world
questions
dangerous when they do.
that's spiraling is, what does this entire episode cause us to rethink? And part of that is a discussion about what NATO's core purpose is, what the budget resources should be allocated to. But that's coming out of what a trend line that had been developing of declining military budgets in Europe, already pressures of cutting down the existing contributions, which can put at risk the efficacy of the institution that is there. So whether you're debating whether the institution should be there or not, it's different from saying, you know, are we going to have a half-broken, half-functioning organization, or are we going to organize how we put resources into it and make sure they're fully resourced? That does require greater European contribution, and perhaps you could say it's because the U.S. is pulling back. I actually think the U.S. is very firmly wanting to work with Europe on this, and that is one of the messages that Obama came to share today. And this was the first time he'd given a speech in the center of Europe, in Brussels.
In Brussels, and I just wanna-
it's a strong message for the transatlantic agenda.
The point is that in 2014, the United States still pulls a lot of weight. Among the sit-downs over the past 2 days in Brussels, perhaps the most overlooked one is the one that Barack Obama orchestrated between the leaders of Japan and South Korea on Tuesday. A very heavy lift, getting these two into the same room amid rising nationalism and saber-rattling in the Far East. And as one Asia watcher told me, only the U.S. has the ability to strong-arm these two to a table. The United States' growing isolationism calls for France's foreign minister to openly worry at a speech he gave back in November. Laurent Fabius saying the choice, which I believe is perfectly understandable, has consequences. Nobody can take over from the Americans, especially from a military point of view. Given the power of the United States, an American disengagement, if this would be the proper way to qualify it, is a global disengagement with the risk of letting major crises fester on their own.
But the French leaders put themselves in that situation. François Hollande attended the NATO meeting in June 2012 when he was just elected. He had campaigned against Sarkozy's former policy regarding NATO. And then when he was elected, the first thing he did went to this Washington meeting and approved the whole anti-missile strategy, which is, I remind, is for France, the fact of just having a part of the whole NATO strategy, which for France is a total loss of military and strategic diplomatic, sovereignty.
Let me ask Andrei GRATCHEV, how multilateral should the Americans be?
Well, I would say that the gamble of Putin is his ambition to try to, I would say, address the West, the Americans above all, but the West in general, trying to explain to them that the world is different. And in this different world, there is now a single monopoly leader. And that Russia claims to be one of the centers of decision. And by the way, going back to let's say to today's speech of Obama, it's a good thing that he came to Europe and to pronounce a speech formulating his philosophy and policy, US policy about Europe. The sad thing is that the occasion for it is the situation with Russia, with Ukraine, with Crimea. And the danger of the whole of it is that let us say, the atmosphere for the discussion of it dangerously reminding the situation of before the end of the Cold War. While going back to the recent crisis, it was with Russia's involvement that, for example, the Syrian crisis was supposed to be resolved. The Iranian problem could have been resolved. So once the West and Russia agree on terms of coming to agreement and to look together for the solution of the international crisis, there is a way out. Once it is not, it's a danger of a conflict.
Well, let's hear from Barack Obama. He said we must meet our ideals with strength and conviction. Still very open to that concept of multilateralism, but with a firm eye on Russia.
Part of what makes us different is that we welcome criticism. Just as we welcome the responsibilities that come with global leadership. We look to the East and the South and see nations poised to play a growing role on the world stage, and we consider that a good thing. It reflects the same diversity that makes us stronger as a nation, and the forces of integration and cooperation that Europe has advanced for decades. And in a world of challenges that are increasingly global, all of us have an interest in nations stepping forward to play their part, to bear their share of the burden, and to uphold international norms.
Which international norms the United States don't apply and don't ratify? If you look at labor issues, the United States is the country in the world that less has ratified the core fundamental conventions of the ILO, for instance. If you look at environmental issues, the Kyoto Protocol, you can look issue after issue. There's one thing the United States is not, in favor of, is those core international principles. So, let us not, he reminded himself the invasion of Iraq. So that doesn't need to be repeated. But there's something, there's a double standard here that it lacks credibility in his mouth.
I think there's room for debate on that, but I want to go back to... Yes, go ahead, Bruce.
I might add to that the U.S. is the only country not to agree to change the formula at the IMF, which, again, adds to that point.
Laurie,
I wanted to go back to an earlier theme and to broaden the discussion a little bit. Of course, the Russia topic in general and the Crimea situation in the immediate crisis with Ukraine is dominating the transatlantic attention at the moment. But the transatlantic cooperation, the transatlantic agenda is so much deeper and richer than that. If you take a look at any number of global crises where capitals with Europe, across Europe and the U.S., European-American cooperation more generally, as you were almost perhaps questioning whether it's working smoothly. I think it's functioning. I may have mischaracterized that. I hope not. But I think it's functioning regularly, consistently, constantly.
All right, but we're about to put it to the test.
And that it's being tested on Russia. But
we're also about to put it to a test in another domain, which was not mentioned in the speech, which is these trade negotiations, these free trade negotiations. Jakob HAESLER, is it a mismatch? What are we realizing the last couple of weeks? That Visa and MasterCard stopped the transactions to Russia Bank in Russia, and immediately they feel the pinch. We realize that in these trade negotiations, when it comes to the internet, e-commerce, the cards are in the hands of the Americans.
What do you mean by mismatch between whom? You mean between Europeans and Americans, or?
Between Europeans and Americans. Do you feel it that way?
I'm a strong believer in free trade, so I'm not saying that the Americans or the Europeans haven't, or anyone actually, hasn't tried to bend rules to their own favor. And so there are obviously issues. There are issues about data protection. You can, as an American, sue a European company in a European court over infringement of that. You can't if you're a European citizen, in a European company in the US. But the overall consensus that, one may not share it, but if you shared the assumption that free trade is good and that in the end it favors people, if that's your starting point, then I think it's a matter of how do you negotiate and how do you move forward the deals. And there are issues, and there are thorny ones and less thorny ones. There's agriculture. There is obviously these famous, chemically manipulated chickens that all Europeans are so scared of, and so forth and so forth. And I mean, I'm not saying that there are no issues, and of course,
do you think those trade negotiations are on the right track? And do you think that with what's happening in Crimea, that's actually pushing those negotiations forward?
Well, they may, because they force the Europeans and the Americans to realize that they better get their acts together on that if they have other stuff to worry about. I think I would dissociate it, though, from the way the economic sanctions are being played out today. I think the idea of saying, if you go into Crimea, I kick you out of South Kensington, of your billionaires' apartments, is kind of ludicrous. And that, I think, the Europeans and Americans, they shouldn't worry about that.
The European Union it has a schedule in front of them, which is now the forthcoming Euro Parliament elections. So around the end of May, what will happen is a live referendum on the treaty itself, because I think it will be an important issue in all of the countries to be addressed, because the MEPs are the ones who, in the end, are supposed to raise the hand, yes or no, regarding this treaty. So at least in France, it's going to be a major issue. And you were talking about testing the transatlantic relationship. One thing that was very, very important, which NSA is the NSA spying. I mean, how can that be more brutalizing on the relation than anything else? But when you look at the attitude of the presidents, I mean, the Brazilian president, Dilma Rousseff, canceled meetings. She tried to, claim some respect from the United States. On the other hand, if you look at François Hollande, all he does is run forward when he thinks Obama wants to go somewhere, and try to run ahead. He did it on other situations, for instance, for the Syrian situation. But the NSA...
that's because the French are spying on their citizens 10 times worse than the NSA.
So
they can't say anything.
That's not what Edward Snowden says.
I mean, look at how easily you get anyone on a telephone supervision in France.
The declarations and the findings of Edward Snowden, I think, are very clear. They're public. They were...
I'm not saying that they're wrong.
We have that information.
I'm not saying that Edward
Let me
Snowden
ask
is
you,
wrong.
these trade negotiations, are they going to be good for everyone?
Are you asking me? I didn't hear who you put that question to.
To you, Bruce. I was saying, do you think that a trade deal would be good for both sides?
I think that what's lost in this conversation and in the broader conversation is that over and above the economic benefits of this, we have to, I think, face two challenges here. If we cannot, the U.S. and the European Union, come to some agreement, then we must accept that the integration of economies across the globe has stopped for the time being. That may be good, that may be bad, but I think we then confront the fact that if the two largest economies in the world cannot share a lot of common values, cannot integrate their economies further, then economic integration, as we've known it in the post-war period, is over for at least our lifetime. Second, and more importantly, is that the Chinese, in particular, are going to be watching. And if they see that Europe and the United States cannot come up with common standards, come up with common regulatory processes based on the rule of law and transparency, the Chinese will take note. Already, companies are telling us, the Americans and the Europeans, unless you have a common standard across the Atlantic for cell phones, for example, we will accept the Chinese standard. And that will impose costs on both your companies. That will put you at a competitive disadvantage. That may open up those technologies to other kinds of nefarious things that are as bad as what the NSA has done. And that's the challenge we face in this agreement. And I think there's not nearly enough focus on those two issues.
Andrei GRATCHEV.
Yes, trying to bridge the two aspects. I mean, the economy and the situation and the crisis over Ukraine. I think that the West should be very careful about trying to use economy like a means of political pressure, or let's say trying to solve a current and, after all, I would say a short-term political crisis, which can be solved by different ways, by diplomatic consultations. And after all, that shouldn't be too much exaggerated, because if we involve economy into this, we are already on the long-term consequences. And on the other hand, there is another aspect. After all, what is the main condition, or let's say the guarantee, against the fact that the current crisis may turn to be the new Cold War? It's the interdependence. It's the interdependence of Russian economy with the world economy, with the Western, with the European economy, and what would put much more pressure and limits to Putin's actions across the world, not only Crimea or, let's say, in the case of Ukraine, is the fact that Russia may suffer, or at least his Russia, he will discover, is no more the Soviet Union, which was a self-sufficient, closed, hermetically isolated from the world economy. It's an economy open to the world. It's a society which is also wishing to stay open to the world, and that's going to be the most important limit that would guarantee us against the continuation.
All right, and unfortunately, that's where we're going to leave it now. I want to thank you very much, Andrei, GRATCHEV, Raquel, GARRIDO, Jakob, HAESLER, Laurie, DUNDON, and Bruce Stokes for being with us from Washington. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.